Hiya friends! Since we're already at episode number 98, I thought this would be a good time to introduce yet another platform into my nostalgia trip games. Today's firstie is PlayStation 2. The big one from 2000. Yeah, and this is my PlayStation 2, the big chunky fat one. Which I really haven't played in, I don't even remember how long, maybe over 10 years or so. But this is not to push aside the first PlayStation in no way, because there's still stuff coming off for that one. And I decided to introduce the PlayStation 2 now, because, well, why not? The big 100 is coming on, and I haven't done anything really special in this series so far. So here's the first 5 games for the PlayStation 2. Enjoy.
Since there will only be 2 or 3 PS2 episodes because there were only a handful of games I ever played on it on a more regular basis, I decided to start on these ones now. The first game that I've chosen to talk about is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game called Viewtiful Joe. Released originally for the Nintendo GameCube by Capcom in 2003, and the PS2 version was released in 2004.
Oh, me?
The reason why I've chosen this particular game to start with is that I remember the game being talked about and featured in various gaming magazines and TV shows 20 years ago, and it was one of the games I remember wanting to buy after eventually getting my own PS2.
Viewtiful Joe.
Back in the early 2000s, The Matrix and its sequels had its impact as much on movies as it did on game design. What Capcom drew from The Matrix to Viewtiful Joe was the capability to manipulate time. This, in addition to the game's cartoony presentation, was what drew me in. Upon further play, the game allows you to purchase new abilities, items and weapons, and from what I've read, completing the game unlocks new playable characters. Did I play Viewtiful Joe that much after actually getting the PS2 and the game into my collection? Well, honestly, no, but I did play a good deal of it for a couple of weeks, as the gameplay itself turned out to be less than adequately interesting, ultimately getting lost in the midst of the already oversaturated genre of side-scrolling beat-em-ups. This is probably one of the more weighty reasons why the game was never particularly successful, at least on the PS2, with around 46,000 copies sold worldwide compared to the original GameCube version's 275,000 copies. So while it's not necessarily a rare game, it's not something you hear talked of a lot in connection to the second PlayStation. Personally, I think it's okay, and certainly a game with some personality. Definitely a good add-in to your collection if you can find it for a low price. Before I bought myself a PS2 from a friend from my music studying years, there was one game we used to play quite a lot with our friends. Quite contrarily to my usual taste, I have to say, because the game in question was 2K Sports ice hockey game NHL 2K6. I think we played the 2K5 version a little bit prior to that, but 2K6 was the one I remember playing and watching people playing a lot more. This happened in my final year of studying, and shortly after I had already moved to another town, but I had some business in my old study area for another year. Before my business in the town came to an end, my friend sold his PS2 for me along with a few games he had for it. Since those days, 18 years ago, I have never once launched this game, but this particular NHL hockey game remains special to me because it's the only one of its kind that I own and have fond memories of.
and welcome everybody to Denver, Colorado. We're inside the Pepsi Center.
I suppose 2K Sports NHL series shares a position with Sensible Soccer, or Kickoff 2, whichever you prefer.
Across the blue line.
From what I recall, the main competitor, EA Sports NHL series, feels noticeably different to play and didn't feel quite as responsive to control or agile. But that's just me trying to remember how it was almost 20 years ago, as I have no intention of trying to relive that comparison to the minutest detail. Oh, and the soundtrack was more appropriate for our style as well.
Behind the net.
To be sure, NHL 2K6 is just about as far away from my usual taste in games as flight simulators and strategy games, but it did offer a considerable amount of fun for what was to be one of the last times ever in my memory to be experienced with friends around the same television set on a new console. The last of them would have probably been the next one.
This was a jolly good assist. It was. He hit the seam. They had just enough room to operate.
This game was a must-have even before I knew I was going to get myself a PS2, but it also gave me the reason to finally buy a racing wheel controller. Gran Turismo 4. The first two Gran Turismo games, particularly the second one, had really made an impression on me, and practically everyone who owned a PlayStation had at least played them, if not owned them. For some reason, Gran Turismo 3 was not as popular in our circle, but GT4 took a firm place in our most played games for a few years.
Here come the morning I say goodbye, but I don't turn around 'cause the reason is treason.
Although the franchise had certainly made progress in graphics and physics, and there were more cars and tracks in the game than in any previous installation, there was one particular thing that kept us coming back to Gran Turismo 4 than any other game in the series before or since: the Nürburgring. Of course, the Nürburgring has since become something of a joke thanks to the lately defunct Top Gear/Grand Tour trio, but it was largely thanks to their exposure to the track that I even knew the scale of epicness the track held. Sure, the usual Gran Turismo tracks like Autumn Ring, Laguna Seca and Deep Forest Raceway are there, and have become just as iconic to Gran Turismo gamers as real-life tracks, but I would say about 75% of the time I ever spent on Gran Turismo 4 was spent on the Nürburgring. Bear in mind, this is the Nordschleife, so while it's not the complete track used for 24-hour racing, it's still almost a 21-kilometer lap. And we played it so much we knew it like the contents of our pockets, forwards and backwards. Now I have to admit, it's been well over 10 years since I last played Gran Turismo 4, thanks to the purchase of PS3 and Gran Turismo 5, which not only included the Nürburgring, but also it had the only appearance of the Top Gear test track in the series, and driving reasonably priced cars around the Top Gear test track was just as addicting for a while as racing the Nürburgring in GT4. The Gran Turismo games are so well regarded for many good reasons, and I cannot recommend them enough. Now I'm not entirely sure, but I think this game, Rez, might be the oldest game I have for my PS2, and it was originally published in Japan by Sega in 2001, while the US and European releases happened in 2002. Similarly to Beautiful Joe, I got my first glimpses of Rez from some gaming-themed TV show being mentioned in a news segment. Now that I think of it, I'm pretty sure the gaming show was actually called Tilt. Well, anyway, Rez was a shooter game like I had never seen before. A rail shooter to be sure, but it was psychedelic in such an extent that Jeff Minter would have probably been proud of. And somehow the gameplay was connected to its soundtrack. A very cool effect. Playing Rez is actually more about precision shooting, recognizing patterns and finding the data nodes that you need to complete your mission, which is to fight off viruses and corrupted programs in a virtual data environment represented by the insane wireframe graphics. The game only has 4 areas to complete at first, but it is said that completing all 4 areas with a 100% score opens up a 5th area. Personally, I've never gotten that far because for me, Rez was always more of a cheap way to empty your mind for a while, and progression was less important than the experience. It is a properly good game though, and apparently it's even better on Sega's Dreamcast console. Either way, it gets my recommendations. My absolute favorite PS2 game of all time is also one of the weirdest games I've ever had the pleasure to play. Naturally, it's a game by Namco, and to many European PS2 gamers' annoyance, the game in question is We Love Katamari. The annoying thing is, we never got the original game, Katamari Damacy, in Europe unless we modified our console and either imported the game or pirated it. For me, the gateway drug was We Love Katamari. It's a game that's almost impossible to describe, but I'm gonna try anyway. You play as a small, tube-headed prince of all cosmos, whose father has sent you to collect all sorts of random objects from the Earth by rolling them up onto your oddly magnetic rolling ball-like device called Katamari, so he can make them into stars. Well, any attempt at trying to make sense into the plot will be useless, and the gameplay is equally mind-boggling. You control the prince and his Katamari with the 2 analog sticks, and the analog sticks alone. Just pushing the Katamari requires you to push both sticks forwards, and moving the sticks to the same direction makes you walk in that direction. Turning requires you to move the sticks into opposite direction from each other. You can do a 180-degree turn by pushing the sticks as buttons, and you can dash by repeatedly waggling the sticks forwards and backwards in opposite turns. You can only collect items that are smaller or as big as your Katamari, but the longer you play, the bigger items you can collect, eventually going as big as cars and houses. We Love Katamari was also my gateway to Japanese pop music, as it has an amazingly varied soundtrack full of different genres and brilliant artists. Some of my favorite Japanese artists were directly picked up from the We Love Katamari soundtrack, although the soundtrack itself remains an item of profound nostalgia to me now. I tend to play We Love Katamari every now and then just to hear the great music, but it is a brilliant game to play too. Thankfully, both the original Katamari Damacy and We Love Katamari have now been remastered and released to PC, as well as Nintendo Switch, the newest Xboxes and PlayStations. But originally, the Katamari games were PlayStation exclusive, and for that, I have been grateful for having bought myself a PS2.